Hey everybody, and welcome back to History Student Reacts. Today we'll be watching how the Greeks almost lost their War of Independence by Kings and Generals. So this is the third part in Kings and Generals series on the Greek War of Independence. So far it has been an interesting series on a very interesting topic. I mean, it's one of the early examples of modern nationalism that's sort of been brewing in the early 1800s. It's also a big moment in the decline and eventual collapse of the Ottoman Empire, though of course the empire had been declining for a while now. If you guys end up enjoying this video, I'd appreciate it if you would check out my Patreon, which is linked down below. And without any further ado, let's get into this reaction.
Throughout 1825, Ibrahim Pasha and his Egyptian cohorts had forcefully asserted themselves as the masters of the Peloponnese, while the Hellenic Republic, recovering from their very ill-timed civil wars, consistently failed to put up an organized defense.
Yeah, that's the point we're at. The Greeks are weak from a lot of infighting among different factions, and the Ottomans have finally managed to mount an effective counterattack. So right now, it sort of looks like the revolution is in trouble.
But all was not lost for the freedom fighters of Hellas. In this third episode of the Greek War of Independence, Missolonghi will fall, and the natal Hellenic Republic will be beaten within an inch of its life. But their struggle will continue, and at their darkest moment, powerful allies, for better or worse, will come to their aid. It's the same deal with our sponsor for this video, Raid Shadow Legends, where the best part is that to defeat
How about that, a raid sponsor? Alright, you guys know the deal. I will link Kings and Generals video in the description below, so if you want to go and give them a like, subscribe to their channel, or check out their sponsor, which they'll have linked in the description of their video, please go do that. Please go show them some support for making these fantastic videos on such a consistent basis.
Link in the description or the QR code on screen to also get a $30 bonus package. The Epic Champion Tayroll, 200,000 silver, 1 energy refill, 1 XP boost,
great
and
deal.
1 ancient shard, allowing you to summon more champions immediately. All this treasure will be waiting for you here.
Great deal, guys.
By now, only a few strongholds remained in Hellenic hands, one of which would be the stage of the most iconic battle of the entire war. Twice had the town of Missolonghi repelled Ottoman siege attempts, the second time famously resulting in the martyrdom of Lord Gordon Byron, English Greekaboo Supreme.
English Greekaboo Supreme. Very accurate description. I will say just the beginning of this video, I had a bit of knowledge about the beginning of the Greek War for Independence, but my knowledge of the rest of the conflict is pretty vague, so a lot of this is going to be new to me. I just thought I'd give that disclaimer that I don't know as much about the rest of the conflict as I do about the beginning and the origins, the intellectual origins of the conflict, which I'm more familiar with.
When Ibrahim Pasha's Egyptian regulars had landed in the south and began their fiery march through the Peloponnese, they had bypassed Missolonghi, seeing it as strategically insignificant compared to the fortresses at Methoni and Navarino. However, while Sultan Mahmud II was mostly content to let his autonomous Egyptian vassals spearhead this latest phase of the war effort, he would not have his own forces sit idly by on the sidelines. So it was that the Sublime Porte appointed one 45-year-old.
The Sublime Porte, if you didn't know, is just another name for the Ottoman government. It's just another way to say that. If some of you were confused by the Sublime Porte, what on earth does that mean? You know, it just means the Sultan's government.
Kutahib Pasha as head of all Ottoman land forces in Rumelia, and told him in simple terms that either Missolonghi would fall or the head would from his shoulders.
Okay.
Thus, while Ibrahim Pasha was conquering his way through Morea, Kutahib Pasha assembled an army in Jania and crossed the Pindos Mountains in spring of 1825, arriving before the walls of Missolonghi by April. The town was defended by a garrison of some 3,000 men. It was under the loose overall command of the Swiot captain Notis Botsaris, and composed mostly of Greek and Swiat Albanian warriors, alongside a small contingent of Italian and German Philhellenes. In comparison, Kutahib Pasha had some 20,000 men at his disposal. 8,000 of these were professional soldiers, mostly of Turkish, Muslim Albanian or Bosnian stock, although some wild Cossack mercenaries from the Danube region numbered among them. The rest were laborers and slaves, taken from the local Christian peasantry. Soon the battle was joined, but although Kutaha outnumbered his foe greatly, he would find Missolonghi to be an extremely tough nut to crack.
As we can see, both sides have a couple different nationalities on them, though, in terms of the Greek side, a lot of those other nationalities are there specifically to support the Greeks. But it's just sort of another instance of, like I mentioned earlier and like I've mentioned in other episodes of this series, we are still at this point in the very early phases of nationalism and national identity. That is, developing at this moment in the early 1800s, and the Greeks, have got a bit of a head start with this revolution. They've really gone out there and really started to develop their own national identity, whereas, some other peoples across Europe, they're taking it a little more slowly.
Prague. The town was protected by 6,000 feet of thick earthworks, prefaced with a large moat and...
And then, not to pause it again so soon, but I just thought it was an interesting note down in the bottom right corner. Sections of these defenses were named after American and European revolutionary heroes like William of Orange and Ben Franklin. So, once again, we can sort of see some of the influences here. The Greeks are tying themselves to this wider struggle, both a European and American struggle, a Western struggle, and perhaps with the reference to figures like Ben Franklin, sort of a tie to the Enlightenment values of the American Revolution. So just sort of an interesting note on how the defenders viewed themselves and their struggle against the Ottomans.
And stationed within strategic gun emplacements. By sea, it was protected by a shallow lagoon and sandbanks, which made it treacherous for Ottoman warships to directly approach. Indeed, Kutaha's initial attempts to breach the town on both fronts were thwarted. Although Ottoman sappers were able to trigger a massive explosion underneath the earthworks on August 2nd, the following charge to take the ramparts, led by the Cossack mercenaries, was repelled by the Greeks. Meanwhile, attempts by the Ottoman navy to blockade the town by sea also ended in failure when the cowardly Kapitan Pasha, Khusrev, retreated at the sight of Greek fireships, fearing being caught in the shallows and trapped in the inferno. This allowed Missolonghi to continue receiving fresh supplies by boat. Despite all this, Kutahib Pasha refused to back down, and since his head was on the line, retreat was simply not an option. However, help was needed, and so Kutaha opened communication with the other invader in the Peloponnese, who thus far had enjoyed far more success against the Greeks. In November of 1825, Ibrahim Pasha's Egyptians arrived at Missolonghi, renewing the naval blockade by sea, and
you needed Ibrahim Pasha to show up and really get the job done. And the separation between, we're talking about Ibrahim Pasha's Egyptians, it's because at this point, some parts of the Ottoman Empire had become rather detached from the central government and were pretty autonomous, and Egypt was one of those regions. Egypt was and would continue to be a fairly autonomous region in the Ottoman Empire, perhaps more like a loosely affiliated vassal state than actually part of Ottoman territory. And so, they're kind of doing their own thing, and that's why we sort of refer to them separately. They're helping out the Ottomans in this struggle, but they've still got, their own interests at heart. And, they're assisting because it benefits them, not necessarily because the Sultan commanded it.
Bringing in fresh professional infantry and artillery by land. From here, the stubborn town's days were numbered. Within the next few months, the Greek ships resupplying and defending Missolonghi were scattered or sunk by the modern Egyptian fleet, cutting off the town's main lifeline. Still, the defenders refused to surrender, but theirs was a futile struggle. By March, they had begun to succumb to diseases born of malnutrition and realized that the walls that protected them were soon to be their tomb. Faced with no other option, Notis Botzaris and the other Hellenic leaders made a plan to break through the Ottoman encirclement and escape, abandoning the city itself, but allowing the men within to live to fight another day.
Wow.
This would amount to a dramatic but ultimately disastrous final charge. On the 10th of April, the defenders burst forth from the town and began carving their way through the Egyptian-Ottoman lines, but they were ultimately overrun. The Greeks and Suiots were slaughtered, and the invaders poured into the town, massacring its civilian male population and enslaving the women.
Jesus. Brutal. Brutal fighting. Horrific stuff. And I just want to say, I made a comment on one of the other reactions, I believe it was the last one, where, I was talking about the overall decline of the Ottoman Empire, and we were referring to the ethnic violence that occurred as a result of that decline. And I said that, any civilian massacre was horrific, whether it be massacre of Greek civilians, other Christian civilians, Slavic civilians, or Muslim civilians. Any civilian massacre is horrible. And one person in particular took issue with that. Now look, I understand that revolutions take violence, and in this instance, I'm in favor of the Greek War of Independence. It's an emancipatory struggle. I support that. But, that doesn't mean that I also have to support any massacres of any innocent civilians. I will never justify that. It's unjustifiable regardless of the reasoning. Though, like I said, I understand that revolutions take violence. So I just kind of wanted to clear that up. I stand by my opposition to the massacre of civilians, which I feel like is a pretty base-level humanitarian position, while recognizing that revolutions are violent and will be violent. This is a horrific, unnecessary massacre, right? It's brutal and it's, unfair.
The Hellenic Republic, it was the single greatest military disaster of the war. After Missolonghi, the Hellenes were hanging on by a thread, but they were hanging on, for a handful of fortresses were still in revolutionary hands, like the provisional capital of Nafplion and the Acropolis at Athens. But the pressure was still on. 3 months after Missolonghi's fall, Kutahu Pasha's army arrived at Athens and dug in for a siege. Ibrahim and his Egyptian land forces, meanwhile, roamed the Morea with impunity, burning villages and carrying off grain and livestock. However, the Egyptians had sustained heavy losses over the many battles he had won, rendering them without the manpower to take the remaining Hellenic fortresses. Consequently, the old bandit Kolokotronis continued to be a thorn in Ibrahim's side. Indeed, beyond the plains and in the hills, rebel activity was still strong, and Ibrahim's Arab corps ventured into them at the peril of being picked off by snipers.
Yeah, we talked about this in prior episodes, but obviously Greece is a very mountainous country. There's some very rugged terrain, and so it's prime territory for guerrilla warfare. And in this time period, we've sort of seen the development of hit-and-run tactics, modern hit-and-run tactics and guerrilla warfare with, for example, the American Revolution. There was some rather innovative guerrilla warfare and hit-and-run tactics used, or the Peninsular War and the Napoleonic Wars. There's a lot of guerrilla warfare used there. That's where we get the term guerrilla or guerrilla from its native Spanish from. We've seen a lot of that here as well. Obviously the natives of the country will know the territory and the countryside better than anybody else, and they can use that to their advantage even if they are facing much better supplied and armed Ottoman and Egyptian forces. Though, they have been getting their asses whooped recently. They've really been struggling against the Ottomans, but perhaps they can muster a comeback at this point.
This inability to take mountainous territory was put on full display in June of 1826, when Ibrahim made the ill-fated decision to lead his armies into the Mani Peninsula. Even before the revolution, Mani had never really been under Ottoman occupation, and when Ibrahim sent an envoy who offered the Maniots death or surrender, the Neo-Spartans sent him back with a reply which would have made their ancestor king Leonidas proud. From the few Greeks of Mani and the rest of the Greeks who lived there to Ibrahim Pasha, we received your letter in which you try to frighten us, saying that if we don't surrender, you'll kill the Maniots and plunder Mani. That's why we are waiting for you and your army. We, the inhabitants of Mani, sign and wait for you. Sure enough, the Egyptians found bitter weeds in.
Yeah, that's great. That definitely would have made the Spartans proud. I love that. They're not afraid of his intimidation tactics. And, that's the benefit of the mountainous territory and the guerrilla warfare. Even if Ibrahim Pasha can take a lot of the important cities, the Greek forces who are familiar with the terrain can always retreat into the mountains and live to fight another day. That's why these tactics are so effective for, smaller forces fighting against larger ones. And we're sort of seeing that here, some of these Greek forces are entrenched in their native regions. And so they're saying to the Ottomans and Egyptians, like, hey, if you want to beat us, you're going to have to come and get us. And we're not making that easy for you.
Mani. The fortified mountain towns defied him, and at the citadel of Vergas, his 7,000-strong army was repulsed by 2,000 Maniot warriors and 500 assorted refugees from the rest of the Morea.
Nice.
More humiliating on his part was the attempt to pincer Vergas by the Bay of Diros, which had no warrior garrison. There, his soldiers were repulsed by a surprisingly fierce countercharge led by local elders and women, the latter of whom became honorifically known as the Amazons of Diros. Thwarted once, Ibrahim launched a second invasion in August.
Beaten off by civilians, defeated by civilians. I think that also goes to show you that the Greeks really, had something to gain, had something to lose. They were fighting for their freedom. They'd made some gains. They are in the infancy of establishing a Greek republic. They don't want to lose what they've already got, and they want to gain their independence. And so you can see that determination even from regular civilians who are willing to pick up arms and fight apparently ferociously against the repressors.
But again he was pushed back, this time at the town of Polyaravos, where the Maniots killed 400 Egyptians, losing only 9 men in the process. The continued struggle of Kolokotronis and the resistance of the Maniots were ultimately small victories compared to the loss of Missolonghi and most of the Peloponnese. However, they were important nonetheless, for they proved that Ibrahim Pasha's Egyptians, who had been virtually undefeated up until this point, were not invincible. Moreover, despite the heavy beating it had received, the revolution was still alive. Although public opinion in Western Europe had always been sympathetic to the Greek cause, the actual governments of those countries were extremely reluctant to get involved, seeing the Hellenic rebels as a threat to the political security of the continent. However, by 1826...
Yeah, and so a note on that. To understand that, we have to really look at the time period. So this is the 1820s. What just occurred in this time period? Maybe the Napoleonic Wars, the French Revolution. Two of the biggest events in European history still up until this day. So, obviously the revolution which led into the Napoleonic Wars disrupted the continent, perhaps more than anything it had ever seen, at least anything it had seen in recent times. And so, following the Napoleonic Wars at the Congress of Vienna, which was the peace congress at the end of the war, the European powers decided to form what we refer to as the Concert of Europe, which was this idea that to keep Europe stable, which we need to do to avoid another conflict of this scale, we basically need to keep the great powers balanced. we need to keep all these countries from gaining too much power, because we saw what happened when France gained too much power. Everything went crazy and we had a ton of deaths on our hands. And we want to prevent that kind of conflict. So we want to keep everything stable and everyone evenly matched. And so they're looking at the Greek War of Independence, and it is concerning them because, the French Revolution is not too far in the past. They remembers what happens when a revolution gets out of hand. They also are worried about, further decreasing the influence of the Ottoman Empire, because they're concerned that it will destabilize the entire continent. I mean, what if the Ottoman Empire starts to fall apart, and then, for example, Russia takes a bunch of its territory? Well, then Russia's too powerful, and then the rest of us are screwed. And so that's why the European powers have so far been very reluctant to get involved. Now, as I'm sure we're going to see, eventually they will get involved, but so far they really haven't wanted to, even though, as was mentioned, the Greek cause has been a pretty popular one throughout Europe. The newspaper reading public really sympathize with the Greek cause, and you have some Greekaboos, as kings and generals called them, like Lord Byron, from European countries who go to fight with the Greeks. So the public is very much in favor of this struggle, but the governments are a little more reticent.
6. Factors, both internal and external, were increasingly pushing the great colonial powers of Europe toward direct military intervention on the Greeks' behalf. By that point, public outcry against the slaughter of the Christians of Greece by Islamic soldiers was becoming too hard to ignore. This sentiment had snowballed after Western Philhellenes, like Lord Byron, began martyring themselves fighting for the Greek cause, and continued to do so after Missolonghi, as an unprecedented outpouring of sympathy from the romantic, educated masses of Enlightenment Europe grew into a force which governments could not ignore.
Yeah, and that's a good point. I mean, you're already sympathetic to the cause, and then Lord Byron, who is a European literary hero, goes to fight with the Greeks and dies. That's probably going to inflame your passions even more. This was sort of an early, public pressure campaign on the governments of Europe. It was rather unique for the time. Of course, we'll see a lot of those kinds of things to come, and I don't think it's the first of its kind. I mean, the abolition movement was sort of similar in nature, but it is definitely rare for its time. The public coming together for this international political cause and trying to pressure their governments into doing something.
Throughout the West, lobbyist societies began popping up to support the Greek cause, such as the Société Philanthropique en Faveur des Grecs in France, which was patronized by the powerful Duke of Orléans. Concurrently, painters, composers, and playwrights utilized their voices to engender sympathy for the Greek cause. All over Europe, Philhellenism became a cultural phenomenon which unified diverse swaths of European society.
Yeah, and, you might be thinking, well, I suppose the Greeks were fellow Christians and it's a struggle against oppression, but wow, these Europeans seem really into the Greek War of Independence. Well, yeah, because they were really into Greece. I mean, up until today, but especially back in this time period, I mean, we've just had the era of Enlightenment that was very much influenced by ancient history, ancient Rome and ancient Greece. So the educated classes of Europe are very into their Greek classics. They understand the contribution of Greek history, Greek culture, Greek philosophy to European history. And so, these, people throughout Europe, the public, they're already very into Greek culture and history. And so they're already predisposed to be very passionately pro-Greece in this conflict, alongside those other reasons I mentioned.
Factor which eventually helped push their governments to action. As Britain and France inched ever closer to sending armies into Greece, individual Briton adventurers continued to go off to fight of their own accord.
Yep.
But no longer were these Philhellenes young students or romantic lordlings, but high-ranking decorated war heroes. Indeed, after Ibrahim's devastating military invasion, Greek leadership was in disarray, and as such, the struggling republic consented to allow members of the British military aristocracy to lead the Hellenic army and navy.
Wow.
Back in 1825, the London Greek Committee, the foremost Philhellene lobbyists in England, secured the private services of one Lord Thomas Cochrane. Long-time viewers of our channel will be intimately familiar with Lord Cochrane and his antics.
Yes, he's a very interesting figure, I'll say that much, and I would very much like to react to videos about Cochrane on this channel, because the little I do know about him, he was a ingenious and just a very curious guy.
A Scottish madman who was perhaps the single deadliest sea captain of the 19th century, having made mincemeat of France's warships during the Napoleonic Wars, only to run afoul of the British government and then go into exile in South America, where he played a critical role in helping Chile, Peru, and Brazil win their respective independence wars.
He was a real adventurer type. I mean, first off, shout out, he's Scottish, representing the home country, but also he was very much a, do it your own way kind of guy, but his way was the successful way. Of course, in military hierarchy, that can often get you in trouble with your superiors, and Cochrane certainly was often in trouble with his superiors. But, regardless of that, he still found himself around the world, getting into crazy conflicts, solving problems in his own particular way. Like I said, I would definitely like to react to any videos about Cochrane on this channel, because he's got a really interesting story.
As Cochrane was sent to lead the Greeks by sea, so too was his counterpart, Richard Church, appointed to lead them by land. Church was an Irishman with roots in the Greek community. During the Napoleonic Wars, he had led an auxiliary regiment of the British Army, composed of ethnic Greek light infantry, to take the French-occupied Ionian Islands. Serving in Church's Greek regiment during this time was a younger Theodoros Kolokotronis. Indeed, the old warlord had great respect for his former British commander, and when Church arrived to command the Greek army, Kolokotronis is said to have remarked, "At long last, our father is come."
Wow.
The two Britons immediately had a unifying impact on the Greek war effort. After Ibrahim's campaign of destruction, the Hellenic government had fallen back into their old rivalries.
Of course.
Mavrocordatos, the old ship of state, had gone into retirement after the fall of Missolonghi, and in his absence, the National Assembly he built, then fought a civil war to unify, had split again into two rival factions of bickering politicians and warlords.
Of course. And we see a lot of similar trends in the Latin American wars for independence, which are also around the same time period, along with, a lot of different struggles for independence throughout history. It's just the very typical infighting between, the liberal politicians who are thinking about, what do we do after the war? How do we stabilize things? How do we run a civilian government? And basically the warlords who are currently fighting the war, who feel like, I can't let these politicians get in the way of what I need to do. I need the power of the government in order to win this war. And, these two sides typically come to clash against each other. And this has happened many, many times. This is just one example.
Based in Aegina and Castri, respectively. When Church and Cochrane landed on Greek soil in March of 1827, they both refused to accept office until the squabbling factions settled their differences, which they eventually did.
Nice.
With the Greeks now about as unified as they were capable of being, the two Britons took their respective positions as Admiral and Commander-in-Chief of the Hellenic Republic and went on the offensive. Their first mission was to relieve the Acropolis at Athens, which for nearly a year had been under siege by Katahu Pasha's forces. This, however, would not go as planned. Ironically, while Cochrane and Church were capable of unifying the Greek factions, they could not stand one another and were constantly butting heads. Their
Of
utter
course.
inability to coordinate or cooperate led to Kataha leading a successful sortie against Cochrane's advance force, which killed over 1,500 Greek soldiers. Seeing their relief army annihilated, the small garrison holding out in the Acropolis surrendered, and Athens fell back into Ottoman hands.
Oh no.
It was yet another heavy setback for the Greek cause. But this was still not the end, for on the great stage on which the concert of Europe performed, the gears of geopolitics had begun to turn. Where Britain's best military minds had failed the Greeks, their politicians would succeed. As much as the eventual intervention of the great powers in the Greek War of Independence was influenced by public sympathy, the core deciding factor was born of Realpolitik. By the 1820s, there was a Russian-sized elephant in the room. The Tsar's influence in Ottoman affairs had been increasing since the 1770s, and as Western Europe watched Istanbul's territory gradually shrink at St. Petersburg's expense, an Eastern question arose. What would happen to the balance of power in Europe if the Ottoman Empire collapsed and Russia doubled its territory as a result?
Look at that. I don't even have to talk. They're making exactly the same point I did earlier about how this was a serious concern for the other European powers. And you saw on that map how in the last couple of decades, Russia had already massively expanded its territory. Throughout the 1700s, particularly the late 1700s and to the early 1800s, Russia had really been a massively rising power, one of the top powers of Europe. I mean, they really set themselves apart during the Napoleonic Wars. They were one of the major powers, and the other European powers were kind of afraid of giving them any more territory because Russia was already very powerful. And like I mentioned earlier, as you can see, if the Ottoman Empire was to fall apart, the two countries in position to take advantage would be Russia and Austria. But, even at this point, Austria was not what it once was. It was already weaker than it had been. And so the easy assumption was that in the case of the Ottoman Empire collapsing, Russia would be the main power to take advantage of it. And there was concerns that they could claim territory all the way to Constantinople. Russia also had a connection to the region religiously. It's an Orthodox Christian region. Russia, largely, the Balkans is what I'm referring to. If you look at the Balkans into Constantinople, a lot of that was Orthodox Christian, though there was, Catholic and Muslim communities there as well. But a lot of the people there were Orthodox, and so Russia, felt shared kinship there. And so, there was, like I mentioned, just a lot of concern that Russia would become extremely powerful if it could eat up all of that territory. And so, of course, this would factor into the other European powers deciding what exactly they should do in response to the Greek Revolution.
Fears of Russian expansionism had been one of the reasons Western Europe operated on a strict policy of non-intervention when the Greeks initially revolted.
Yep.
For they hoped that if the Sultan crushed the rebellion quickly, then Russia would not take advantage of the chaos to gain more land at the Ottomans' expense. However, the rebellion was now in year 5, and every extra day it fought on increased Western fears that Russia would finally involve themselves.
And yeah, Russia was always the most likely to get involved because they had the most to gain. I mean, we saw at the beginning of the revolution, or even predating it, someone like Ypsilantis, the early failed revolutionary, one of his promises was that, if they started the revolution in Greece, then Russia would shortly come to help. Because of that shared culture and shared religion of Orthodox Christianity. So there was an expectation for some Greeks from really early on that Russia would step in to help, and Russia was always the most likely power who would join the conflict. And so I'm sure at this point, France and Britain are probably getting quite concerned that eventually Russia's just going to say, you know what, screw it, and get involved. Because eventually they're going to have more to gain than they'll have to lose.
Fears which were exacerbated when the geopolitically conservative Tsar Alexander I died in 1825 and was replaced by his much more ambitious brother Nicholas I, who immediately started putting the screws on Sultan Mahmud, forcing him to sign the Convention of Akerman in October of 1826, which greatly increased Russian influence over the Ottoman-controlled Romanian principalities. This put the powers that be in Western Europe into political overdrive as they scrambled to ensure that Greece would not ultimately become a Russian-dominated satellite, as all Ottoman territories in Europe seemed on trajectory to be. Thus, Britain launched itself into Greek affairs, on the subtext of containing Russia and the pretext of stopping the still-at-large Ibrahim Pasha from carrying out an alleged barbarization project in which he supposedly intended to enslave and deport the Peloponnese's entire Christian population and replace them with Egyptian farmers. As it turned out, Britain...
I don't know if that claim is true or not. It sounds a little far-fetched, but there certainly was a high degree of brutality in the actions of Ibrahim Pasha. I'm not sure if there was an attempt at genocide. Perhaps there was. They said right there that it's contested by historians. But it was definitely a brutal conflict. That's undisputed.
Britain and Russia would not have to butt heads over Greece. Largely due to the efforts of Foreign Secretary George Canning, the two superpowers came to an agreement in which, for the sake of global stability, they would jointly mediate the ongoing conflict between the Hellenes and the Sultan. France, meanwhile, had been initially reluctant, but soon also joined in on the negotiations. The ultimate result was the Treaty of London, signed on July 6, 1827. In it, the three greatest powers in Europe finally declared their official support for the Greek cause.
And finally is the right word for it. This is taking place in 1827. It's been years since the conflict has started. Usually, the great powers love to get involved in absolutely anything they can get involved in, but this shows you how reluctant they were to support the Greek cause, because it has taken them years to do anything to aid the Greeks, because they were so worried about, stability and the balance of power and all that stuff.
Sponsoring the creation of an internally autonomous Hellenic state, albeit one that would still pay tribute to and recognize as overlord the Sultan in Istanbul. The Treaty of London was engineered to be a conciliatory resolution for all parties involved. The Greeks would get their independence, albeit in a limited capacity, while the Ottomans would nominally maintain their territorial integrity. The Russians, who, per the Treaty of Kuchuk-Kainacha, were the nominal protectors of all Orthodox Christians in the Ottoman Empire, would still be able to sink their claws of influence into this new Greek nation. Meanwhile, the British and French had seemingly solved their Eastern question by preventing the Ottomans' collapse and containing Russian expansion, all while appeasing their ravenous Philhellene citizenry by aiding the Christian Greeks. There was only one problem. The Ottoman Sultan completely rejected the terms. The bluff had been called, and the powers of Europe would now either have to drop the matter or enforce their demands by might. They chose the latter, and so it was that in the summer of 1827, a joint Anglo-French and Russian fleet, composed of the finest warships in the world, sailed for the Ionian Sea. The Greek War of Independence was about to become an international war. In our next and final episode on the Greek War of Independence, we will cover the decisive naval battle of Navarino, so make sure you are subscribed and have pressed the bell button to see it. Please consider liking and sharing.
Alrighty. I'm excited for the last episode in the series. Obviously it's not much of a contest between the Ottoman Empire and three of the most powerful countries / militaries in the world. But we're going to see how that goes down. And I find this, like I said in the beginning of this video, this conflict is really fascinating. For sort of the nationalism elements, which they haven't covered too much in this series, but I find particularly interesting, and something we got into a lot in this episode, the geopolitics. I really enjoy that. I find geopolitics interesting. The geopolitics of this post-Napoleonic era are really fascinating. So yeah, if you guys enjoyed this one, I'd appreciate it if you would leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and check out my Patreon, which is linked down below. I hope all you guys are having a good day today, and I will see you all again next time. Goodbye.